This is now our third year hosting this convening. And we're grateful for this partnership with Seri and the work that they do and many other partners in the room. Sometimes we go to dialogues for other people, but I'm here very much for myself. I just reflecting on my personal journey, I went from a young girl to getting married, to running a household, trying to run a household. And suddenly I found myself being an employer. And, no one teaches you or grooms you on how to manage that relationship. So I'm very much here for myself, for my own consciousness and to grow in my own awareness. And especially now that I have a young child, I've seen how my own domestic worker has morphed into being a caregiver and helping me raise my 19-year-old son while I'm at work. And so I think there's even a greater moral responsibility in my own life, but I'm sure for many people here and that will watch this video, that how do we go about educating people, educating myself on how to make the best of that journey so that we break from the past and that we forge better relationships. And so I'm here to learn, and I hope that we can. I look forward to learning from all of you, and I look forward to taking this conversation forward. And I also want to, in this what is meant to be welcoming remarks, push Seri as well and provoke them a bit, because I think obviously conversations are good, but I look forward to in the near future seeing targets around. What should be achieved around certain targets and the kind of plan that needs to accompany that. So all the best with convening this evening and for discussions. And I really hope that the discussions and the input here today transcend the boundaries of this room, and even also transcends time, and that with the years to come and the months to come, that we're able to make progress on this. So welcome, and I'd like to now hand over to the Honorable Koketsi Moiti, who will be emceeing us today.
I am only taking my mask off so that if anybody needs to read my lips while I'm speaking, they are able to do so. But nevertheless, we are gathered here to have quite a discussion. There are very few Black people in this country who do not have some connection to domestic work. Long lines of my own family have been domestic workers. We know people who have domestic workers, and today some people also have domestic workers as well. There are many things that some of us in this room expect from our employers. When I wake up in the morning and I go to work, I expect if I trip and hit my head at the workplace, I expect care to be given by the workplace. It's a small thing, it's a humane thing to do, but there are many people in this country who do not get to experience this. And it should shock us to our very core that it took such a tragic death to get us to a point where domestic workers were able to be included in the legislation offering compensation to them. It speaks of a society that is deeply inhumane, deeply uncaring. But it's not unusual. We read about other instances as well. We hear about domestic workers attacked by dogs in the workplace. We hear about people hired as domestic workers, but given other labor in the household to do as well, right? We know that domestic workers who live within households often don't actually get time off. They are expected to work throughout the day and throughout the night. Apparently my comrade voice isn't on point. It is unthinkable that this continues to happen today. given what a long history this country has with domestic work. And so as we sit here, gathered here to have this discussion, I really want us to reflect on how domestic workers are treated by those of us in this room, how domestic workers are treated by those we know, our loved ones, our colleagues. But over and above that, what can we do? Seri has printed a whole bunch of resources that have been made available at this discussion. If your own domestic worker is not registered, you will be guided at every step of the way on how to do it. But beyond that, take it to those in your life who too have domestic workers. We should make it such an abnormality that we can read something about a domestic worker being injured in the workplace. And we should normalize that even though your private household is personal, it is a place of labor for someone. And therefore, the very same things we expect from our workplaces should be granted to those who work in our homes. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker of this evening, Judge Victor, who scribed the majority judgment in the Mahlangu case during her time as an acting justice of the Con Court. Judge Victor, welcome.
Apparently, there is a microphone, but let me see. Good evening, and thank you for the introduction, Koketsu. It just automatic. Yes, right. It's a great privilege for me to be here this evening. You know, in the life of a lawyer, I see some of my colleagues, former colleagues from the bar and others that have appeared before me. It is really only once in a lifetime that one gets a case allocated to you, certainly as counsel, if you're lucky enough to get the brief, or as a judge for your senior to allocate a case to you. And I was so pleased when this case of Sylvia Mahlangu was allocated to me. The circumstances of her death, as Koketso has mentioned, are very sad. And for those of you who don't know the facts, Ms. Sylvia Mahlangu worked for a family in Pretoria, I think it was Fairy Glen, for 22 years. And over the years, her sight became impaired, but she continued working. And of a day, she was tasked to clean the windows outside next to the swimming pool. And she stood on a ladder to do that task. And unfortunately, she fell and she couldn't swim. She fell into the swimming pool. And her family were obviously devastated. She was the main breadwinner. And fortunately, the NGOs and the Commission for Gender Equality and the Women's Legal Centre in Cape Town, and also the trade union, SADSAO, brought the case to court, and of course, Ms. Mahlangu's daughter. So the slide you see before you is really one of joy and ecstasy of a domestic worker celebrating the outcome of the case. And this is juxtaposed to the very sad death of Sylvia Mahlangu. And her death changed the rights of domestic workers forever in this country. Now, what was the situation before Ms. Mahlangu's death? COIDA was the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act was promulgated in 1993. And listen to the wording in 1993. COIDA expressly excluded the rights of domestic workers. In terms of subsection 8 in the definition, an employee means a person who has entered into or works under contract of service, but listen to this, but does not include under numeral 5, a domestic employee employed as such in a private household. Now, can you imagine it took from 1993 until the case was finalized in 2021 for that to change, when that provision of excluding a domestic worker was declared invalid by the court, and I had the privilege of being the scribe in the case, and what a privilege it was. Now, Ms. Mahlangu's rights included equality, dignity, and the concept of Ubuntu. And I was also very privileged, whilst acting in the Constitutional Court, to write about the jurisprudential aspect of Ubuntu in the law of contract. It's the case of Bidika. And although the interim constitution had the concept of Ubuntu, in the final constitution, this really came under dignity and equality. But nevertheless, Ubuntu is firmly embedded in our constitutional jurisprudence. And then I also had the privilege of being able to take the concept of intersectionality much further, and I'll deal with that in a moment, and also what South Africa's international obligations are in relation to domestic work. Now, I say I'm privileged that Justice Yaqub is here, because I read the case of Yusta versus Score, where Justice Yaqub said, COIDA is important social legislation which has a significant impact on the sensitive and intricate relationship amongst employers, employees, and society at large. The state has chosen to intervene in that relationship by legislation and to effect a particular balance which it considered appropriate. Now, you know, one would have thought by 1999 that there would have been greater movement to implement the principles that Justice Yaqub had spelt out in the case of Yusta. If one looks at Section 27 of the Constitution, everyone has the right to have access to social security, including if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, and they are entitled to appropriate social assistance. And the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resource to achieve the progressive realization of each of these rights. And as I've emphasized already, it took so long, and it took the pain of domestic workers having to endure that, what I say is humiliation, after the implementation of the Constitution. And it took the Constitutional Court to change that. Now, we know the Section 9(3) rights. The state may not unfairly discriminate against it, directly or indirectly, against anyone on any one of these grounds: race, gender, sex, and there's a whole list. And one asks the question rhetorically, well, why wasn't Section 9(3) enough? Now, to bring the facts of Ms. Mahlangu's case, yes, there was indirect discrimination against domestic workers. And, but society still lacked the systemic structure to right the wrongs against domestic workers. Professor Kathy Albertine posits as the need for the concept of equality to be developed beyond the idea of equal concern and respect. In discussing the plasticity of the concept of equality, she reminds us that the goal of equality is to remove systemic barriers to substantive freedom and actively to create conditions of equality, including attention to restructuring relations. Well, then we say to ourselves, well, wasn't Section 9(3) sufficient? No, it wasn't, because there's a large area that remains unaddressed, and that is the plight of a domestic worker who is struck by intersectionality, discrimination at intersectional levels. And, it's just self-evident that the burden that a domestic worker had to overturn this provision was enormous. Now, you say, well, why wasn't Section 9.3 enough? What about Section 10? Section 10 of the Constitution provides that everyone has an inherent right to dignity. The way domestic workers had been treated and excluded showed that their work was undervalued. The idea that the duties performed by domestic workers do not constitute real work. And that is also a concept globally, and international organizations are fighting that. And it's also, domestic work is also seen as an inherent feminine endeavor, and they were treated in a deeply sexist way. And then we have Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and she coined this phrase of intersectionality. She said that individuals at the intersection of different oppressed groups experience oppression in a unique way. And you can see that intersection of race, sexual orientation, gender, and so on, nationality, disability, and also the undermining of the work. Now, what does intersectionality mean? And to those of us who are lawyers here, I say that the concept of intersectionality is a very useful tool, because it's not only in relation to gender discrimination, but all sorts of discrimination. So what Professor Crenshaw was the first one to coin the concept of the intersectional nature of discrimination. She wrote as a Black feminist on women's studies. She recognized and demonstrated how overlapping categories of identity, such as gender, sex, and race, impact individuals and institutions. And I think it's a complex concept. It had been mooted quite early on in the Constitutional Court's jurisprudence, but it was never applied as forthrightly as it was in the case of Sylvia Mahlangu. And I felt very privileged to be able to scribe. And then you say, well, Section 9.3, intersectionality, dignity, Ubuntu, was that not enough? And no, those who made submissions before us said, no, we've got international obligations, and I won't go into these because I've only got 10 minutes and I see the yellow card emerging. But just look at this. We've got the Maputo Protocol. We've got the Domestic Workers Convention, number 189 of 2011. And let me tell you, internationally, a lot of effort is going into this convention and applying it. We ratified all the conventions to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. And Sylvia Mahlangu's case was really where we could apply, without fear or favor, all those four concepts that I've referred you to. So it was a wonderful result created by the joint efforts of unsung heroines, our domestic workers. I'll never forget sitting in the court and seeing the domestic workers, seeing women responding to the arguments that were made to us, and knowing that this affected them to their core. Also, the Commission for Gender Equality was there. The Women's Legal Trust Centre was there, and so was Satsawu. So thank you so much for your attention. And let us never forget the life of Miss Sylvia Mahlangu, a sacrifice which is even too painful to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you. As expected,
That was a good way to kick off the evening and set the context. So we're going to head into a panel discussion right now. But before I call the panelists to join me, those who would have received the invitation would have seen that a representative of the compensation fund was meant to join us for this discussion. Unfortunately, this afternoon, the panelist withdrew and is not here. We know that there are questions that are probably directed to the fund. Please, you will get an opportunity to ask questions. If there are any, we will take note of them and make sure that somehow we do a team to find answers. But I just wanted to let you know that the invitation had been made. And so with that, it gives me great pleasure to ask the panelists to join me. I am going to start with Maggie Mtombeni, who is from Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance. Maggie, can you please join me this in front? And then I'm going to ask Jane Barrett from the Women in Informal Employment and Globalizing and Organizing. So before we kick off the discussion part, we have asked the two speakers to give us some input to set the ground. Jane, will you kick us off, please?
Thank you, Koketso. Thanks, everybody. Is this working or do I need to switch it on? It's working. It's such a pleasure to be here today to reflect on this incredible victory in the courts some years ago. But it's also, I think, a time for us to reflect on the unacceptable gap between law and implementation in this country in so many areas. And not least of all is the whole question of COIDA. I don't have the current statistics of the number of domestic workers registered for COIDA, but my guess is that it doesn't even reach 100. The task is so enormous, and there is such an absence of will on the part of employers, and particularly on the part of the collective employers represented by business, to push employers to register domestic workers for COIDA. There are huge obstacles. If anyone's tried to go on the website to register a domestic worker for COIDA, they will confirm that it is near nigh impossible to register a domestic worker as an individual. So there are huge mountains to climb, and it has been left to the domestic worker organizations, the representatives of domestic workers, Satsau, Izwi, and Udwosa, to fight the fight for registration. And they can't do it alone because of the atomized nature of employment in the domestic sector. The challenge of a domestic worker to push their own individual employer to register them is so enormous, and the isolation experienced in doing so is such that it's not fair to leave the responsibility with the representative organizations. So I hope today we can reflect on other paths that can be used to support the domestic workers in their struggle for registration for not only for COIDA, but for unemployment insurance too, because both battles were fought by the domestic worker organizations, and the COIDA one was won in court, the UIF one was won through struggle, including the domestic workers chaining themselves to the gates of Parliament to demand the inclusion of domestic workers in unemployment insurance. So I want to just reflect, Judge Victor talked about Convention 189, which is an international convention that guides the employment conditions for domestic workers worldwide. And this is something that was agreed by the tripartite structures worldwide in the International Labour Conference, which is the annual conference of the International Labour Organization. And the way that it works is that the three parties come together on an annual basis and they talk about, they agree on topics for international labor standards. And one of them was the Convention on Domestic Workers, Convention 189, which was adopted in 2011 after a long struggle of domestic worker organizations worldwide through their trade unions to get onto the table of the International Labour Conference, a discussion on domestic worker conditions. To cut a long story short, it was adopted in 2011 and South Africa ratified it in 2013. The Department of Labour was actually very active in 2011 when it was adopted in Geneva at the International Labour Conference. So it was a huge surprise that when they came back home, somehow the interest in manifesting the Convention 189 in law, somehow the interest waned. And just to explain how these things work, once a convention is ratified by a country, which South Africa did in 2013, it then becomes legally obliged to translate the commitment that it has made in law. And the core, sort of the heart of Convention 189 is that there should be no discrimination and no distinction between the rights of domestic workers and the rights of other workers. And so while we had the BCEA, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, UIF had now been extended to domestic workers. There was the minimum wage for domestic workers in the same way that there was a minimum wage for other sectors. But COIDA just remained elusive and excluded from the rights of domestic workers, despite South Africa having ratified a convention that says there should be no discrimination. And so that was the reason why the domestic workers had to go the legal route to fight for a ruling in court, which finally was made in 2021. So 8 years after ratifying the Convention for Equal Treatment, finally the government was instructed to change the law by the Constitutional Court. And that story of sort of, I think one can call it benign neglect of the domestic workers has continued, because although the ruling was put in place, the law now says all employers of domestic workers must register their employees for accidents and injury, and it's a payment once a year. It's registration and a payment once a year, unlike unemployment insurance, which is a monthly payment. There is, as I said at the beginning, there are very, very few domestic workers who are registered because of the obstacles. And so there are obstacles to that registration, but there's also a lack of information. Employers can easily say, I didn't know, where are the billboards? Where are the TV adverts? Where are the radio adverts? Where is the threat of retribution to employers? Where is the inspection? There is no cost to the employer for just remaining ignorant and remaining passive in this context. So in order to change that, my view is that government, the Department of Labour, needs to take on a massive campaign for registration. They need to lead the way. They need to spend the money on the billboards, on the radio adverts, and they need to do that in conjunction with the Commissioner for workers' compensation, as well as with the Unemployment Insurance Commission. So, you know, what have the workers' organizations done to try and make this happen? Well, 2 years ago, they had a joint workshop. The three organizations came together, convened by my organization, WeGo. They met with representatives of the Commission for Unemployment as well as COIDA. And I have to say, they were quite receptive in that workshop. But it needs a lot more than that. It needs a real bullet under the backsides of the Department of Labor and these two commissions to get things moving. And I think it needs a concerted effort on the part of BUSA and the other big employers' organizations to say, it's all very well to have this, you know, marvelous equal treatment on paper. But if it's not actioned, it means absolutely nothing. So, yeah, just to say that the three organizations, I'm sure Maggie will talk about it, are working on a campaign. The banners, the posters that you see have been jointly agreed by the organizations, and they are pushing hard, but they need the support of other organs of civil society, but especially the employers and organs of government to make this thing happen. Thank you, Kuketsi.
Thank you. Maggie, I'm going to invite you to just jump straight in.
Thank you. Oh, it's on. Oh, thank you. First of all, I would love to thank you, Nelson Mandela's Foundation, Seri, Udosa, and then specific, I think, Mom Pinky, and then Satau for pushing on my Mom Slivia, because I think without them, we're not going to win this COIDA thing. And then I'm also like to thank you, Wego, for the pushing which they did with us. So specifically today, I'm going to be talking about migrant domestic workers. As we know that we do have migrant domestic workers in South Africa, which are more vulnerable, even though those other domestic workers who are South African, they are as well, but migrants is paid to waste to them, because most of the employers now, they love to employ them just because they know that they can't do anything, like when it comes to UIF, because most of them, they are undocumented. When it comes to Department of Labor, when they register a domestic worker, a special migrant, they said there is a certain number which they are going to create for migrant domestic workers temporary, which is 13 digits as a South African ID, which means you can't even go to the Department of Labor as a migrant worker to check if you are registered. You're only going to notice the day you are going to be claiming your money. And then the other thing with Department of Labor, when it comes to migrant domestic workers, they don't even screen the paperwork when it's come to registering, because they know that they are going to be benefiting something. They're only screening those documents only if the domestic worker is claiming. But if the domestic worker is contributing that 1%, Department of Labor is not even screening those documents. They don't even care. They only care when you're supposed to collect your money from Department of Labor, which is difficult. Most of migrant workers, they are being registered and then they can't claim anything because they are going to be needed some documentation which they are not going to be able to have those documents. So I think Department of Labor is supposed to screen paperwork before employer register a domestic worker. And then also when it comes to the contribution, some employers, they register domestic workers and not contribute at the Department of Labor. And then you're going to see your payslip as a domestic worker that I am contributing, your money is being deducted, but it's not going where it's supposed to go. And then Department of Labor is not doing anything about that. And then when it comes again to the employers to Department of Labor. When they send their inspectors to visit employers' homes, they go with Home Affairs, which is affecting migrant domestic workers, because some of them, they're going to be undocumented. And then those Department of Labor inspectors, they go there and visit, they go with Home Affairs. And then when they go there, obviously the employer is going to win, because the Home Affairs is going to be doing their job, arresting the person who's undocumented, and then the person is going to be deported back to her or his country, which means the employer is not going to do anything after that, because the employee is not there anymore. And then because of the documentation, I think the Department of Labor is supposed to visit employers' home separately with Home Affairs. Even if the Home Affairs is supposed to go there, I think they are not supposed to go together, because it's ending up employers winning the case, because they know that I'm hiring this migrant, undocumented migrant, because I know that one day, if ever the Department of Labor visiting my home, they are going to visit with the Home Affairs. So she's going to be sent back to her country, and then I'm going to employ another undocumented migrant domestic worker. And even if it's going to happen continuous, because they know that nothing going to happen to them. So I think the reason why employers are not complying is just because of Department of Labor. Because, like example, when we look at some other department, like traffic department, they do have those laws. And then after they have those laws, and then if ever the drivers are not complying on those road rules, there is some traffic officers who are on the street enforcing drivers to follow those rules, which means if you're a driver and then you're not following those traffic rules, you're going to be given a penalty, like a ticket. So you know that I have to behave as a driver. But Department of Labor is not doing any enforcement employers, because, like example, most of domestic workers, they are not registered on UIF, while they are also supposed to contribute that 1%. What more on COIDA, while they're not going to be contributing anything? But what if, like the question is not going to go anywhere, because the Department of Labor is not here? And then if the employer doesn't comply, what will happen? Nothing. They can't be enforced to comply and register their domestic workers. The government can't do anything. So if you, like example, if I was going to be an employer, 3 years comes, I was not going to register my domestic worker, knowing that nothing will happen to me. It's not going to, nothing will happen. So I'm going to hire a domestic worker and not register her. And then she's keep on going to remind me that, can you please register me? Can you please? And then I'll keep on saying, oh, the website is not going through. That is the answer from the employers. So the website is not going through. And then until when? And then even those domestic workers, when they're supposed to claim their money from Department of Labor, they're being sent back in now and then. And then I don't think some employers from Department of Labor, they are well educated about what they're supposed to do when it comes to domestic workers. Because most of the times when it comes to domestic workers, when they claim their money, including those who are South African, all the time the system is always down. All the time the system always down, especially maybe only if domestic workers, the system is down. But when some other workers who are contributing more than domestic workers, because we know that as domestic workers were earning less, so my 1% is nothing to the Department of Labor. But from some other companies, the 1% means something to them. So when it comes to somebody who's paying 10,000 1% from her or his salary, they're going to act, and then the system will never be down. But when I'm going there to claim my 200 rand, the system will always down. I think it's a discrimination for domestic workers, because we do have those cases whereby domestic workers, they go to Department of Labor and then they're ending up give upping, because they're going to use their transport money going there now and then they're ending up, they give up, especially migrant domestic workers, because they're going to be sent to the embassy to fix this. And then when you come back, they're going to say, oh, this is Maggie, but you can see M is not, you can't see even that this is M. And then you're going to send back to the embassy again. I think the only thing what they want is their domestic workers' contribution, but they don't want to give them what they want. And then the other thing, I think some organization which are helping domestic workers right now, I think they have to engage employers' organization, It can be an employer as individual, but I don't think they're going to act. They are going to hear whatever they were going to be talking about, but they're not going to do anything after that because they know that they are not going to be forced to comply on domestic workers. But I think it's going to be coming from domestic workers employers organization. I think maybe it can be a change because we know that employers, they are those domestic workers organization clients. So I think because like there is some employers who don't even have a contract with their domestic workers. So I can't ask for my contract and ask for my pay slip and expect my employer to register me for UIF and COITA because I'm begging for my contract. I'm begging for my pay slip. My pay slip I'm begging just because I just want to see is when it's going to show me that I'm registered under Department of Labor. So our employers, they don't even want to give domestic workers their pay slip because knowing that they are not deducting anything. Sometimes they might deduct, but they don't contribute to the Department of Labor. You are only going to notice that you are not, it's even say you are not registered. So now, and then the other thing when it comes to COIDA, our employers, when you're hit, they want to take you to their doctors. And then that doctor, she or he even going to be told that don't do this because they know that they are the one who's supposed to pay you while you are injured, and then they're supposed to claim that money from Department of Labor. It doesn't mean that employers, they don't even know what is happening. They always go to the Department of Labor's website. They know exactly what is happening, what they're supposed to do, but they don't want to comply. And then they know exactly that even if they can't comply, nothing will happen to them, because we are just domestic workers. And then the other thing I just wanted to touch is about, I think I did touch most of the key things here. Yeah, is the last thing that the question is those employers going to comply on COIDA? And then there's those cases which they happen 94 back to now. You think those employers are going to agree that the scar was from at work? Because I might even lose all the medical reports. But if my employer can even witness that, yes, she was, but they can't because they know that they don't even know that they are not going to pay anything. I think they're supposed to be educated that even if I have a scar 1994, now Department of Labor is the one which is going to pay me, not them. I think they're supposed to be educated about that because they know that they don't even know that they are not supposed to pay me now if I have that scar which happened 10 years back. They thought maybe it's going to. At the same time, most of the employers, they don't even know that if you have a domestic worker worked for you for 20 years, you can still register that domestic workers from that 20 years and do the back pay. They don't even know. I think Department of Labor is supposed to follow their rules. At the first time, Department of Labor put those rules, but they don't follow those rules. At the same time, they are educating employers not to follow those rules because themselves, they are not even following those rules. Thank you.
So as you were speaking, Maggie, one of the things that came to mind a couple of years ago while I was hanging my washing, somebody passed by and said to me, "Don't you have a domestic worker? You should really get somebody to work for you. You can't be doing all of that." And I said, "No, I can't afford a domestic worker." And this person's response, much older than me, was that, "Oh, just get yourself a girl from Lesotho or Malawi. You don't have to pay them much and they never complain." It's a memory that sticks in my head forever. But as you were speaking, it just came to mind once again. Thank you. So with that, we have the great fortune of having Justice Zach Yacob with us today. You would have heard Judge Victor refer to his judgment earlier on. I am going to invite him to join us and respond to these inputs that we have just heard, And I also want to particularly make note of what Jane said about the unacceptable gap between the law and implementation. Thank you, Justice. Please join us.
Okay, good evening, everybody. And thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be here. I'm here because I'm a member of the Socio-Economic Rights in SERI, and they paid for me to be here, for which I'm very grateful. They didn't pay me a fee, they paid my airfare. But I wanted not particularly to respond, because everyone has said wonderful things, and mine would be an indirect response. And I want to concentrate on action. What can we do? Because we can criticize all kinds of people and say all kinds of things. And before I say, what can we do? I would like to tell you two stories about a domestic worker we have in our house. When my mother-in-law was living with us, she missed money from time to time. And one day, Anu caught her red-handed, taking money from her mother-in-law's bag. And so I said, nonsense. I don't care what a good worker it is. She must be fired. And my wife said to me, no, sorry, don't talk nonsense. Really, we've got to give her a chance. And she came up with the idea that let's ask her how much she's stolen and get her to pay it back to us. And then we'll keep her. We asked her how much she'd stolen. She said 1,700 rand. And I said, well, it may be a right figure or a wrong figure. But if she pays back that amount of money, she can stay. She has been with us for 34 years now. She has been a wonderful person. She's still part of our house, and she's absolutely amazing. And one of the lessons my dear wife taught me was don't get too much onto a high horse and don't think that you don't take into account the weaknesses of others. And that is what we need to understand. A second story I wanted to say is that I talk to our worker Bangizwa quite regularly about her friends and what they talk about and what they do and so on. And I went to address a meeting of 20 or 25 of her friends as domestic workers. And I asked them, and this is not a survey, one would have thought that African people would be the best bosses and white people would be the worst bosses. But the consensus of opinion, and that's why this is not really a race question, because we oppress our own people. All the African domestic workers, they were 90% sure that the Indian people were okay, the white people were the best bosses, but the African people were absolutely the worst bosses. So we need to bear this in mind and make sure that we don't confuse two things. Now for action. What do we do? Because we've got to do something. You see, this is part of the revolution that we all have to participate in to create the kind of society contemplated by our Constitution. Our Constitution did not create the society that we want. It created the basis. It gave us the opportunity, it gave us the strength, it gave us the power to do what we can to change society and be part of the whole thing. And therefore, what we need to do is to make sure that we can organize people, and we need, as much as, court cases are not all, and Margie, I'm not criticizing you at all. Our court has held that gay and lesbian people can get married. 95% of the people in this country, and that may be an underestimate, still say gay and lesbian people live in sin. So it's not the court cases, it's what we do to persuade society. The court cases are important because they give us a lever from which to move. And a court case, I'm sure Margie will agree with me as a writer of the judgment, is far, far from the end. It is actually the beginning of a struggle. And we must use that as an instrument, as a lever, as a kind of trampoline, if you like, to get into the struggle and do it properly and get it right. So what do? The first thing is that at a very personal level, I raise these issues at every function I address and at every function I go to. And the worst function to go to still are Indian weddings, I'm very sad to say. Malema accused me of being a racist because I said that 90% of the Indian people I know are racist. It is true. What I didn't say is that 90% of the African and white people I know are also racist. So the non-racism thing is a different fight. But when you go to weddings and functions and see people, and when your friends are having dinner with you, my wife sometimes gets embarrassed with me. But it is important to raise these issues, at weddings and so on, to talk to people about it and get people to change their minds. And I'm telling you that every time you talk to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, and you persuade one person, and if that one person persuades 10 others, and if those 10 persuade 10 others, in 30 years, you see, it's a long struggle, not easy. In 30 years, you will multiply that to thousands. You'll have thousands of workers. And there is nothing for it but to work hard ourselves and change society with the people we know. So for me, that is the fundamental of a revolution. You organize and mobilize. You start amongst the people you know best and do what you can to fix it and persuade. Because if you can't persuade the people you know, you're not going to persuade anybody. And sometimes some of those people shout at me. Some of them want to give me a hiding, but because I'm blind, they find it a bit hard to do. But I can still make people quite angry. And it's a difficult thing to do. And basically, we've got to do it. So that's the first thing. Organize and mobilize and speak to people in our own right. Organizationally, what do? Well, there are a number of targets. The first thing is it is not domestic organizations, domestic worker organizations who have the responsibility to do this. It is all our responsibility. And I would suggest the formation of a domestic worker network of which all organizations are members and a number of, like the UTF, you see, which is a broad front who got together and to do things. So we have a domestic worker network. Just the name is not binding on us. We get a number of organizations into the fold and sit together to work out a strategy. Because working out a strategy in these things is not difficult. It's not easy, sorry. And once we form that organization and we get 20, 30 people to attend it, and we have a 1 or 2 day conference with people to agree to work out a strategy, then we can do it. And let's consider it, guys, a matter of absolute urgency. And let's go ahead and let's do this. Form that organization and get together and fix it. Some ideas for the strategy. Department of Labor. I think that Margie and Margie, you can nod if you are listening to me, are quite happy if organizations establish a meeting with the Minister of Labor and the Labor Department in these matters to make ourselves available to attend the meeting and to talk to officials and work through problems with them and work out how we can do it. No point in just complaining about it. Let us get a meeting. Let us meet people at the highest level. Margie has been a judge, I have been a judge, and we've got to use somehow the clout we have and any other people and whatever they do to push it very much forward. The third thing is an domestic worker employment organization. Because that's the only way you can have employers taking part. And there, we have to be flexible in the strategy. Because I have a guy working in our garden who gets paid very well and who is an illegal immigrant from Zimbabwe. Don't look at me, all of you. I treat him well. And if any unemployment person, if the Department of Labor or the police comes, I got an arrangement with my domestic worker, he'll just hide somewhere. And that's it. So in any case, as long as you pay them well and look after them, if you have a good worker who come from another country, then you must support them at that level in a very flexible way. He's from Zimbabwe, actually, and the interesting thing about him is that Zimbabwe people always don't have African names. But this guy has a very royal name. His name is Kingston. So the Kingston Trio, you know that song, Down the Way with a nice sake and all. But anyway, so that is the other thing we can do. Must form employers' organization. And then at the next level is a joint meeting of employees and employers. Because I don't like the idea of domestic workers getting together and planning themselves and employers getting together and planning themselves. We've got to talk to each other. And one of the ways to do this is through the domestic workers we have. We can get our domestic servants to help us to organize and mobilize and work things well. So guys, thank you very much for the opportunity. These are just the beginnings of some thoughts on a strategy. But this issue is so important that we ought to get on and move. The time for talking is over. The time for action has arrived. Thank you.
Oh, so much to take in. Thank you so much for that. Eh? Before we move along, I just want to make a little bit of an acknowledgement here. There are many organizations in this room that have been working to advance the rights of domestic workers over a very long period. But I also want us to invite Sylvia Mahlangu, daughter of the late Maria Mahlangu, who brought the case with Sao, to please stand up. In her absence, though, may we please give a round of applause and just remember that this was a devastating loss, and to take such a loss to advance the rights of all is no small feat. Okay, so we are getting to some Q&A, and it will be opened up to all of you for some questions. So please, what does it tell us about our society that it took so long and that it required the court to get domestic workers included? Why such a basic labor protection is implemented? What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, I guess the first thing to say is it's not unique to South Africa, which is not to diminish how awful it is, but you know, it's a feature of particular kind of work that domestic work is, that lends itself to all over the world to a kind of invisibility, a taking for granted, a seeing but not seeing. And, you know, that's the case not only for domestic workers, but for so many other workers in the informal economy. waste pickers, street vendors, all manner of other workers in the informal economy who are seen as unimportant to society, unimportant to the economy, unimportant to the way the world works. And there's such a blindness to the reality that every domestic worker is making it possible for her or his employer to be gainfully employed by another employer. And so their contribution to economic activity at large, and particularly to the care economy, is huge, but it's unrecognized and unseen. And it's a struggle for domestic workers all over the world to be recognized and to be seen for who they are. And that is important contributors to the way the whole society works, from the raising of children to the keeping of the home to, all of those activities. So, yeah, it's a challenge of the hierarchies that exist in our societies, and hierarchies that are bolstered by the way the economy works, through extraction of labor for the purposes of profit. That there is a hierarchy of importance, and that at the bottom of the pyramid are those who are seen and rewarded the least, and those are the domestic workers, all of the others who are working informally, and many other workers who are informally employed, and not recognized as contributors to society at large.
Maggie, you spoke about the specific vulnerabilities that migrant domestic workers face, right? And just some of the challenges, these visits that are undertaken with Home Affairs, and the ways in which migrant domestic workers are repeatedly silenced. From where you're sitting and what you're seeing, what is one simple action that can be taken right now that is a low lift, right? But would help support and make it better for migrant domestic workers just right now as we leave this room? What's one thing that in an ideal world should happen in your view?
Oh, it's not an easy question, because I think as domestic workers organizations and unions, we do have this challenge, as I believe that Satao, they also have migrant domestic workers, and then UDOSA, and then there is MIUSA, which is a migrant union. So I think the only thing is to educate Department of Labor. It can't be educated by us as domestic workers union, but it can be educated by the government to educate their workers about the treatment of domestic workers. And then when it comes to the visiting of the inspectors to the employer's house, I think they're supposed to go one by one, as Department of Labor this week, or maybe next week, as the guy said that he have the illegal migrant domestic worker, and then when he knows that the inspectors are coming, he just take him to hide. So I think that is not to hide is a good thing. But also employers, those who are employing migrant domestic workers, they are not supposed to employ them just because they are undocumented. They have to employ them just because they are domestic workers, like some other domestic workers. And then they can even help them to seek for the documentation, because you can even go to the Home Affairs as long as your employer write a note by saying Maggie is my employee, and then I need Maggie only. The reason why I need her is just because of this and this and this, and state why they need me, while there is somebody who's a South African who can work as a domestic worker. And then they can still help them to seek for the legal papers. But now most of employers, they just hire migrant domestic workers just because they want to mistreat them. So I think also domestic workers, employers, they also supposed to know that it's not only being a migrant, but there is other things I can do as a migrant. I can be a domestic worker. I can clean as a local domestic worker, but hire me as a domestic worker, not just because you have a reason why you want a migrant domestic worker, because you know that you are going to benefit on not registering her or him at Department of Labor. And then you know that you can't give a contract, because most of the employers, yesterday you had a case at CCMA. And then when we sit down with the commissioner, the employer said, before you start, she's undocumented. And then the lady worked for her for 3 years. He knew that she was undocumented. Why she's raising it now?
Yeah.
So I think also the employers, they have to be educated on employing migrant domestic workers. They have to employ them just because they need their service, not just because they want to use them.
Thank you. Thank you. Justice Jacob, I mean, your opening remarks, quite a call to action that you gave us there. But when Judge Victor was speaking, she mentioned, quoting your judgment, about COIDA being a state intervention in the nature of the relationship between an employer and an employee, right? And it almost feels like it's a form of a social contract. Can you just say a little bit more about why this is important?
That she made to the insurance in terms of the contribution that the employer's core supermarket was making. And the amount she got was a reasonable amount of money in the end. But she sued then SCORE to say SCORE must pay her more money. So unfortunately, I had to rule against her, because this was a contract between all the parties involved in labor relationships. And we could not allow an employer who already makes a sizable contribution to be sued again, making their contribution to the insurance, but to be sued on top of it. If, however, as the judgment says, she suffered something which was not covered by the insurance, then that might be a different matter. So I had to encourage the relationship between the various parties involved in these contracts, because it was in the long-term interests of the workers. But I had to reject, I had no choice. It was a hard decision, but to reject the short-term effort of the worker to get more money from SCORE Supermarket when she had already been paid according to the insurance at that time. In fact, I can't even remember the amount now, but she had already been paid a fair amount of money by the insurance company for what she suffered, and she wanted more money from the insurance. So it was a sad case, but that is the context in which I made the comments. And I suppose that when people were speaking about blindness, they're not referring to me, they're actually referring to there are none who are not so blind as those who will not see. I thought I should just say that.
Yes. Thank you so much. Given the time constraints that we are facing, I do want to open it up to the audience. If you have questions for members of the panel or reflections that you would like to share, and I see a couple of hands already shooting up. Very nice. So we will start with you over there at the back, and then I'll head your way. Do we have a roving mic? Excellent. Can you please stand up so she can see you?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tumamna Sipozo. I am a final year student at Rhodes University, and I'm currently doing my final year in dramatic arts. So we're working on a production where we want to explore the lives of domestic workers, looking back from, other historical, art forms that were used, like Madam and Eve, and all coming up until this point. And even me, myself personally, was raised by domestic workers. My grandmother was a domestic worker. My mom was a domestic worker. So looking at how domestic workers are treated and have been treated over time, there's a couple of things that I have observed, through this. So my mother kind of inherited her job from my grandmother, right, who was working there initially. And my cousin and I stayed with my grandmother in the household where she worked at. And she would refer to her employers as madam and master, right? Which is obviously something that was a norm, considering like when she started, in apartheid times. But when my mother inherited this job, she also adopted, that same form of addressing madam and master. I hope in South Africa right now, there aren't any domestic workers who are still addressing their employers as madam and master, but you see, there are, which is, I think, one of the first issues that we have within that industry, because the domestic worker, like was said in this meeting, it has this form of invisibility to her, him or whoever they are. They are not seen in the spaces in which they are working in. And there's this TikTok famous, I would say, domestic worker, but she refers to herself as a housekeeper, right? And I think that's one of the first places where we can look at as to, are we still continuing? Whereas, I mean, by definition, there's nothing wrong with domestic worker, but it's also the weight that the title has carried over these years and the stigmas that have been attached to a domestic worker. So my question ultimately, right, would be, are we in a space where, one, we need to, professionalize domestic workers to make them entrepreneurs, where they are now rendering their services, from a professional point of view, where they don't do anything without, paperwork, where they don't work without anything like that. But then obviously it is hard because they come from places where it's very desperate for you to get that job. And also, are we at a point where we need to re-look at that word or that phrase, domestic worker, and be like Mbali Nhlapo from TikTok and call them housekeepers? Because essentially that is what they do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take one more question and then I'll come back, right? Are you happy for me to take in twos? Jane, Maggie, everyone? Okay, super.
Thank you. I'll carry on with that form of address, but Nkosikazi Mtumbeni Ngiyabonga for reminding us of migrant domestic workers. We know.
What's your name, please?
We know about the exploitation of migrant workers, agricultural workers, or those on the mines. We learned at an early age. My father was a forester and we lived in a remote forestry station in KwaZulu-Natal. But he was very strict about forms of address. So the domestic workers called us by our first names, not as master or madam. But if we said kitchen girl, we got a hiding. And he'd start in Xhosa, which was his first language, Chinam Twan, Ukulumuna Nkosikazi, Ukshatila, Upetangani. You're talking to a married woman with children and you're calling her a girl. So we never did it more than once. And the same applied to the garden boy. But I still hear those terms quite a lot. And it embarrasses me. And I think that's why a housekeeper, or maybe just the way you address people, is important. A maid I also find to be quite diminutive. I think that's also the wrong way of addressing it, although it does seem to be quite common in usage. As far as the farm workers go, I did some research in Mpumalanga Lowveld, and it was clear that the farmers were employing Mozambicans because if they got injured, they took them to Home Affairs at Komatipoort who deported them. And they could pay them far lower wages. But I also experienced the opposite in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, where farmers would say to me, take the worker to their doctor, they would pay the medical bills, they would pay the worker whilst he or she was recovering, and then they'd put in a claim to the Department of Labor, and whatever came back, which took a year, they would give to the worker. So, I think there's a good side to it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Very unusual and very helpful to share that there is examples of some movement on this. So I want to turn over to this side. Maggie, how are you Are you happy to respond to the question about professionalizing and the title? I mean, one of the things that's also very unhelpful is the term helper, right? It suggests you're there to help. There's an entitlement that it suggests, not that it is labor and a service being rendered that should be paid for. What do you think?
Okay, thank you. I just have the name which is coming from domestic workers. They prefer to be called house managers. They're house managers. And then there's something which I forgot about. The reason why most of the employers want to employ some undocumented migrants is just because they don't want to pay minimum wage. Because when you're supposed to register your domestic worker, you're supposed to be paying her or him the minimum wage. So that's the other reason why they like to employ those undocumented migrants.
Thank you. Jane, any reflection on potentially professionalizing the space?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really important question, and certainly domestic workers all over the world have argued that in the demand for recognition, not just as in the one-on-one employment relationship, but in the sector as a whole, that there should be training offered. And of course, in this country, we do have a worker training regime through the CETAs and so on. But it's very undeveloped in this sector. The one challenge is that, and that the domestic workers themselves are debating all over the world, is do they want to introduce a kind of hierarchy of within a profession. So, for example, there's quite a strong movement to argue that wherever care is given, whether it's childcare or elderly care, or that should be recognized as an additional or as a job on its own, that it shouldn't be mixed up with other domestic labor jobs or tasks. But then the question becomes, do you argue then that the carer of children or elderly people should be paid more than the cleaner? Does it then diminish the role of the cleaner? So there are quite complicated debates to be had around the professionalization, that, in professionalizing, one needs to be careful not to then introduce a hierarchy of those who are more important and those who are less important, or that get paid more or get paid less, but that nevertheless recognizes that there are different jobs or different tasks that can be performed. So it's quite a complicated issue that really only the domestic workers themselves will have the real answers to that question, I think.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I think one thing for me that is clear, though, right, is even where it's not professionalized or the hierarchies are created, where there are these multiple roles being filled by an individual, they should be paid properly, which is currently the problem that we have, that people are doing multiple jobs, whereas they are labeled domestic workers, but fill so many other roles as well. Pay people properly. That's one simple good start, I think. So I am taking advantage here. Before I get kicked off, I just wanted to invite a question or two more from the audience before we start bringing it to a close. We have a hand over there. And we have a hand at the back.
Hi. Should I stand? Okay. Thanks. I'm from the CCMA, so I'd like to say thank you for the invite, and also to just request that WhatsApp group that was suggested by Justice, that we be included into that WhatsApp group. But what I'm picking up, or what I'm hearing in the discussions, is the key issues which are causing somewhat of a struggle is awareness and accessibility. And I think for us as the CCMA, as a commissioner myself, what we pick up is, when it comes to domestic issues, because of lack of accessibility, we have an approach where we get the information at the tail end. So we're more reactive than we are proactive, in that, as one of the panelists has indicated, that you'd find that a domestic has been working for years for a specific employer. In working for years for the specific employer, they've been underpaid throughout. And then by the time that they do come to the CCMA, we are sort of limited in what recourse or relief we can give. But I just wanted to find out from the unions that are here, we have what we call a DPWNO program as part of our functions as a CCMA, which is creating awareness, training, and all sorts of mechanisms. And we have also in the CCMA what we call vulnerable sectors. And in the vulnerable sectors, you'd find domestic workers, you'll find retail, farm workers, and private security. But the issue is, we always somehow find ourselves doing training for private security, for retail, but it's very tough to get a collect group of domestic workers to reach out to then create the awareness that is required insofar as national minimum wage related issues, basic conditions of employment issues, because I'm hearing the issues of migrant workers and the likes. Just because a person is a migrant worker, if the papers are in order, or even if they're not in order, if they're unfairly dismissed, I think the act is quite clear, and case law is clear, that that person has the very same rights as a citizen of South Africa. So I'm not sure who I would have to speak to, because I think it's key and it's important that somehow we do open this dialogue. And in this dialogue, I see the CCMA hasn't been mentioned a lot, but I think we do have a role, especially in creating awareness. And I'd also, out of interest, want to find out, I'm hearing domestic, but in the definition of what a domestic worker is in the BCEA, it extends to what you call loosely a gardener. But I barely see gardeners coming in to claim issues that a domestic worker would do. So again, it goes to an issue of awareness, or whether or not that very same said gardener is aware that he would qualify for the similar rights. I'm also would be interested to find out from the unions that I hear that nice challenges have been taken. I've also read Section 17 of the LRA, which talks to trade union rights within the workplace, especially insofar. And there's a restriction there, which I think, in light of what is happening with COIDA, I think also needs to be sort of looked into, possibly challenged, because if you read Section 17, it sort of restricts access insofar as a union accessing its member, insofar as what other unions would, also creating that barrier insofar as accessibility is concerned. And it also has a restriction insofar as what information I, as an employer of a domestic worker, would have to divulge in an instance where I'm indicating that I'm retrenching you in terms of 189, or we discussing issues of perhaps an increase in that. It says that such Section 16 rights are not accessible, or you are restricted in terms of Section 17. And I'm not sure if domestic workers are aware of the amendments to the CCMA rules recently, which obviously, if you're still restricted in terms of Section 17, should you refer a case, you would be then able to rely on the newly amended Rule 29, which talks to disclosure of documents and other evidence for any case that is referred by an employee. So I've said a mouthful, but thanks for the opportunity, and I'm hoping that we are able to open a bigger and better dialogue in this instance, because I think as a CCMA, we would appreciate a situation where we are able to reach domestic workers. Sorry for the time. Thanks.
I tell you that there is not a lack of people to talk to who are here today, and encourage you to please stay for the light supper that will be served. Everybody has seen your face. We will all be coming for you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Maggie from Satao. We always look at the solution, what must be done for the world to see that domestic workers are suffering. We've got platforms, we've got TVs, we've got radios. While Department of Labor doesn't push the TVs like to make a story, maybe a movie dramatized by the lives of domestic worker. Maybe someone come up with a story to show the lives of the domestic worker and in a dramatic way. I've been asking this question because we see awareness about HIV. Now it's voter thing on TV. It's coming a lot, but why this one can't? We see we have mine workers movie. We know how it's called Mkotin. It's a story about them. You get touched if you watch that story. But why about domestic workers? Nobody is coming up with it. Maybe the solution will come from that. But I think it goes to the Department of Labor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jane earlier also spoke about the need for a massive media campaign on the issue, right? And we've seen how effective it is. HIV/AIDS is one example. There are so many things, adverts that I remember as a child that I still sing to myself right now. So we know it is an effective tool. And maybe that is the first ask that we take away from here. Each one of us, how do we put pressure on the Department of Labor to undertake such a campaign? Thank you for that. I am going to take one more.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lindy Wenkwanyana from Satsau Union. I just want to put a comment on Judge Justice to say thank you so much for what you have said, that we need to organize and mobilize, although it's not easy because we are working as individuals in the private property. So it's not easy to organize some of the domestic workers, especially on my site where I'm working in River Club. Most of the workers there of domestic workers are the migrants. So sometimes you used to talk to them and tell them about the union, and they even scared to talk to you if you are starting to talk about the union. So it's not easy to find the domestic workers to come and join the union. And secondly, I want to say thank you to you, ma'am. As you said that as domestic workers, we need to come together and organize ourselves and join the union, especially to Izwi, Satsau, Udosa, and Miwusa, so that we can come together and do one thing, because we are fighting for one thing. And also the name of the domestic workers. Thank you so much, my son, for that, because also me, I hate that name of domestic workers, because we were in one workshop in, I think in Cape Town. They said we rather call ourselves as care workers. I think that's a good name. And also that name you have said, because that name is undermining us to call ourselves as domestic workers. Thank you so much, my son, for that. I think I'm done at the moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And shall we take one more? This will be a closing one.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm always being pushed to hold the mic. I've been here for the 4th time, and I've been seeing only the domestic workers in the house. I have never seen the new faces of the employers to say they're coming or they've been invited. So it's always about domestic workers. Last week we were at Siri. They're educating domestic workers. where are the employers? How are they getting the information? And as for him, they always come to domestic workers and collect the information and use it whatever they use it. But where does the information end? When do they come to us and have a conversation with us? They never come to have conversation. They always come and collect the stories. They always come and collect the information, but they will never come and say, okay, now we want to have conversation. We want to have people coming forward to help you. They just keep the information and then they'll come and say, we are researching. They are always researching. Where do they take the information to? How do the information reach the employers? Because already here, there is a house full of domestic workers which are being educated every day. And I would like to also to touch to my brother there who is saying there is no way that he can reach domestic workers. We've got unions that has been invited by labor to come and be educated. So it's for me, it's a surprise to hear him saying there is no way that he can get contact to domestic workers, of which there are a lot of unions, because when you look at it, Satao has been like active. Udosa has been active because Mama Pinky has been everywhere. So it becomes a surprise when he said he doesn't have any way to connect with the domestic workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad because we are going to leave him with a way to connect this evening, and which is a good thing. But I also do want to point, it is an important point that you raise, right? That to what end? When the stories are told, to what end, right? And so for all of us, the challenge is to think about, what do we do with the information? Is it to drive an agenda that supports this very real struggle? Or is it merely to extract for individual benefit, right? And that will determine what is helpful or not. Now, with that said, I do want to thank our wonderful, wonderful panelists for joining us. As always, your insights were amazing. Thank you to a wonderful audience. There are a couple of people who had said they are happy to be interviewed after this. We are going to ask you to please remain in this room when we step out right now. So yeah, you know yourself, please remain in this room. Once again, before the Executive Director of the Socio-Economic Rights Institute join us, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists for all of the insights. And of course, I am taking liberty here because Nomzamo will be saying thank you, but I also do want to acknowledge that as we are sitting here, many are fighting the struggle daily. It is not a matter of coming for a single event. And I also want to acknowledge that work, right? Thank you for all you do.
Thank you so much, Koketo. And thank you to everyone for being here. I think when we came at 5:05, we're like, the room will be so empty. But all of you are here to participate in this. And I mean, it's the third event that we're having on this. And I remember the very first time we planned the event, we invited the Minister of Labor. And he accepted the invitation. And then
the mic is there.
There's a double mic now. Sorry. And then on the day, we received a message that he can no longer participate. And we're like, of course, it was a hoax. There was no way that he was seriously going to attend this event. And his secretary advised us that he had been summoned to come to Parliament and answer to Parliament that day. That's why he couldn't come. And we couldn't believe it. He sent the Compensation Commissioner at that time, Mr. Mafata, to come and speak to us and participate in that very first conversation. And then the very next morning, we woke up to a headline about the grilling that the Minister of Labour got in Parliament. And we sat there thinking, oh my word, so he was not lying. It was real, he intended to be here. And I think just for domestic workers, I think just the reason I'm telling that story, say your struggle matters. For house managers, your struggle matters. For care workers, your struggle matters. It matters at times to important people like Justice Victor, like Justice Yakub, to people that people might not see as important, like Umam Jane, to people who've walked the journey with you with 1 million domestic workers rising. Your struggle is important. And I always try and explain whenever I speak to people about why the struggle of domestic workers is important, is that it is the core face of the struggle of women in South Africa. Many people don't know that we have 18.3 million people who are employed in South Africa. 16.3 million people that are employed in South Africa. That's according to the quarterly labor survey. But 800,000 of those people are domestic workers. That's 5% for people who know numbers. 5% are domestic workers. This is a huge sector that employs, that ensures that there's food on the table for so many people, that ensures, as mentioned earlier, that people who do work are able to go and do their jobs and are able to focus on what they are doing. But for some reason, it's been ignored. And listening to Justice Yakub when he spoke, I normally just refer to him as Zach, but out of respect for everybody that's here, he actually had a slip of tongue, because he said domestic servants. And I remember my body went like this, right? I held it in. But that's the reason, right, we've been stuck. The reason we've been stuck is because people think that domestic workers are servants, that they are not actually employees. And the reason why, for instance, many people felt that the term domestic worker is good is because it has worker in it. And therefore it will be obvious. And after probably a decade of that term being popular, we're actually still stuck here. It has not been obvious. And possibly even if we go for house manager or if we go for care worker, we're still going to be stuck, because at the end of the day, domestic workers are African women who are at the very bottom of the ladder, right? And until the life of an African woman matters, we are going to have the struggle. And that's the reason why it's important for women to participate in the struggle. That's the reason why the call to have this issue part of Uzalo, part of Generations, part of Isidingo. I don't even know if it's still airing. But those shows to remind us that actually this is the life of women, right? And I was actually called not to preach. I was called to thank people. And now I've forgotten. But firstly, as I said earlier on, I'd really like to thank all of you for honoring us with this invitation and coming to attend. I think I'm grateful to have had someone from government say, even though the Compensation Commission could not come, the CCMA is in the room, because we were quite clear from the beginning that this needs all the stakeholders, right? We are quite grateful, Justice Victor, that you agreed to be the keynote, to reiterate why this judgment was so important. I think it's also very, very important that in the room, we still have the people that fought the struggle. Right? That even if we don't have Sylvia Mahlangu here with us today, but we have Isatsao in the room, that we have Izwi in the room, that we have Black Women's Caucus in the room, people who, when we were in Pretoria in 2017, made sure that they filled the streets, right? Who made sure that people know that this is an important issue. When we're getting ignored in the media, it's people who said they will give with their own bodies. They will attend the High Court. They will attend the Con Court. When this issue didn't matter, to have in the room people like the Veslow Clinic who started this litigation, to have my colleagues at SERI who've been working on this from the beginning, to have people who believe that the struggle of women in South Africa is important and the struggle of domestic workers in South Africa is important in the room. As SERI, we are honored. But also, I always say this, I don't see Sumaya anymore. I always say that because we kept being stuck on getting people to give this issue attention, we thought we need to have a big name, to borrow a big name. And we thought, what name is bigger than Nelson Mandela in South Africa? In fact, whenever you go in the world, when you say Nelson Mandela, people remember, oh, you're from South Africa. And that we have been grateful that for the last 3 years, we've been able to convince the foundation to borrow its name to this cause. And they don't just borrow us the name, they give us the venue, they give us the resources, they give us the live streaming, they make sure we have quality videographers. I mean, I remember in that first convening, we had, I think, about 120,000 views of the video. And we're in this small room, right? The people that came to attend were few, but the people that were reached by that conversation were over 100,000. And so as we sit today, I don't want us to be despondent. I want us to remember that we have had victories. Mahlangu is a victory. Yes, we cry for Ubomka Maria, but Mahlangu is a victory for domestic workers. We know you had another victory. You've had the minimum wage equal to everybody else in the country. And in the very same way that we are complaining about enforcement today, we will not be complaining about enforcement in 10 years' time. Because in 10 years' time, you'll have enforcement. In 10 years' time, we'll have minimum wage paid. Because of small steps that are taken by committed people in your trade unions, in civil society, within the government. I want to say this because they're an important role player. We'll be able to have success. And with that, I'm really sorry for keeping away from your dinner. I want to thank everyone, thank the team at SERI, especially Lauren, Yongeza, Matete, I don't even see you. They're outside. Our colleagues from the Inner City Federation, you made sure they come early to assist us. We really appreciate it from the team at the foundation. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your energy, your time that you put into this. And I just want to say this for everyone in the room and for the foundation especially. When the day ends, you'll stand on the right side of history. In your work supporting domestic workers, in your work supporting migrant domestic workers, in your work supporting the poor who remain struggling for a better South Africa. Thank you.